Hi folks, Alan Neal here for the Product Management Show, doing a drivecast this morning on, I want to talk about the topic of documentation and Agile. Topic came up recently working with some folks who, when I asked for, when I asked for some documentation about, some previous projects and ongoing work in a B2B, large B2B type software application environment, they said, "Oh no, we're Agile. We don't do documentation." And it's a perspective I've heard many times, and really, it's unfortunate. I guess as things move so fast in our society, people tend to pick up the sound bites. So they read the Agile Manifesto and they say, "Hey, we're." I think the way the Agile Manifesto mentions it, they say they favor conversations over documentation or something like that. But the intent there is not that we have no documentation, but unfortunately, I think that's the way a lot of folks have interpreted that, and it's really unfortunate, and I think it's really expensive, especially in a situation that's more complex, like an enterprise B2B type environment, like an application of some complexity, where you're going to have a number of different stakeholders. You're going to have turnover over time in terms of who's responsible for the application. So, with complexity and with turnover, you cannot have no documentation, in my experience. So the analogy I thought of, and I did a quick LinkedIn post on this last week, was the comparison that came to mind was cholesterol. I've been listening to a blog on ketogenics, and they had an episode where they focused on cholesterol, and I thought it was a very good analogy because at one point, and a lot of doctors and patients probably still believe this, people just thought, okay, cholesterol is bad, so if you have a high cholesterol number, then you're in trouble. And if you have a low cholesterol number, that's good. But then when you start to peel back the layers of that onion, you realize that that is an oversimplification. That, in fact, it turns out there's multiple kinds of cholesterol, specifically high density and low density, and that one type is bad for you. But when you look at the science, which is what this podcast I was listening to talked about, it talks about how you would not be able to survive without cholesterol. It's a basic building material for your cells and your cell renewal, which is going on constantly, but won't get into that too deeply. So I thought that's a really good analogy, so I think this Agile perspective that all documentation is bad is kind of like the earlier and simplistic view that all cholesterol is bad. I think documentation is fine, it has its place, and like I said, in complex environments such as enterprise B2B applications where you've got multiple stakeholders, multiple systems, you've got system-to-system interfaces and all of that business, then you need some documentation. A lot of the original precepts of Agile, can really only be implemented literally, I think, in the simplest of environments. So if you're a single person developing, a mobile phone app, in your basement, then I think a lot of these things apply, and you can even scale. And let's say you're working with a very small team, of 1 to 5 people, let's say, then all of these agile principles can be taken very literally. But when you move to an enterprise scale, that is that's just unrealistic to assume that you can implement those agile principles literally. You can still aim for the benefits. So the main one being, in my mind, that we apply an age-old principle, which is that we can reduce and or manage risk better by breaking large complex things into smaller things. And in this case, what we're talking about is, let's not invest 2 years of, let's say, 24, or let's just use round number. Let's not invest 2 years of 20 people, let's say at an average of $100,000 per year. So that's 20 times 100,000, so that's $2 million per year times 2. Let's not invest $4 million to release something only to find out that our fundamental assumptions about the requirements and the needs were wrong. Instead, why not invest, again, let's keep it simple, why not invest, let's say, 2 sprints of a month long for, let's say, 2 people, and maybe let's find out that we've got those requirements and those basic assumptions wrong for, let's say, $5,000 instead of $4 million. So those are I think are the ideals that scale very well and apply equally in terms of benefit to enterprise applications. But this whole idea that we don't need any documentation, I believe, is simplistic and probably really just an excuse, because documentation can be boring, it can be hard, but it doesn't have to be quote unquote documentation in the sense of the old days either. It doesn't have to be a 50-page market requirements document or business requirements document. It doesn't even have to be a written document at all in this day and age. We can record videos, we can record, get everybody on a Zoom or Skype hangout and record that and have that. But it's basically saying, listen, to scale at the level where we need to communicate, not just across complex organizations and multiple stakeholder groups, but also communicate across time. So let's say I'm the product architect, I design an enterprise business application. Today we're using Agile. Imagine in 5 years' time that business application is now a mission critical application in that context, and you're coming in and you're inheriting that application. Should you have to completely reverse engineer that application in your head to get a sense of what the original design assumptions and approaches were for that application, or is it more cost effective? Is it more risk neutral for the organization to demand some level of documentation in recognition of the fact that in an enterprise context, applications can live a very long time, and they need to be maintained over a very long time and over a great many number of stakeholders or shepherds for those applications. So something needs to be captured. In addition to documentation, I think we can look at simpler, more easily digestible things like diagrams, whether it's use case, interaction diagrams, object models, entity relationship diagrams. So again, this maps well back to the cholesterol analogy, because the whole thing about cholesterol is, and a lot of things that one takes into one's diet, is, can the body process it? And I think what we can learn from the Agile principles is, the body, which is the stakeholders of an application, cannot easily process or digest, pardon the pun there, large monolithic, 50, 60 pages documents, 6-point font, but they can digest diagrams, they can digest videos, they can digest summaries. So it's about creating documentation or information that can be quickly digested by stakeholders and is not in a format that dissuades, if you will, or disencourages consumption of the material, which I think has been the case historically. So Alan Neal for the Product Management Show. This is a morning CarCast that I'm doing, and basically trying to persuade folks out there that unless you're in the most simple of environments and situations with regard to building an application with a very small team, maybe with a very small life cycle, don't assume that you can get away with no documentation. In anything but the most simple situations, you will need to be able to communicate over time. You'll need to be able to communicate over organizational and departmental boundaries. And to do that, you will need some kind of artifacts. Doesn't have to be a 50-page document, all text. It can be pictures, it can be video recordings, audio recordings, whiteboard recordings, but you will need something, some kind of artifact that's a vessel that can travel, as I said, not just across time, but also across potentially organizational boundaries, definitely over departmental boundaries and functional boundaries. You will need something to communicate. That's just a reality of large-scale enterprise systems. So happy to hear your comments. I'm on Twitter at the PDM Show. That's THEPDM SHOW. Same thing on Facebook, facebook.com/the PDM Show. Find me on the web at www.pdm.show. And look forward to hearing from you on this topic.